koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui, ngā mihi aroha kia koutou katoa. Thank you for coming tonight to hear about Whakakotahitanga, which is the first FASD diagnostic guidelines for Aotearoa. My name's Andi Crawford, and I was a Tangata Tiriti co-lead for Whakakotahitanga. In my day job, I'm also a clinical psychologist. I work at Te Aramanapo here in Hawke's Bay, and that's a service that supports pregnant women and parents of young children who experience addiction. I also spent a number of years working for child development services, mostly in assessment and diagnosis of FASD. So welcome. What I'm going to do next for 8 to 10 minutes is just to provide a bit of an overview about how the project was set up and who's been involved. In terms of how the project was set up, a few years ago, so I think it was July 2020, I was approached by Harsh from the Ministry of Health, and he asked whether we could have our own guidelines for Aotearoa, and at that time they were talking about adapting the Australian guidelines. We knew that we had to do it differently here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, so I contacted my colleague and good friend Sarah Goldsberry. Many of you will know Sarah, to talk to her about whether we could do and develop a guideline that also not just provide diagnosis for FASD, but upheld the responsibilities of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Her and I then spent the next few months talking with Hapai Te Hoora, Alcohol Health Watch and the Ministry of Health, and we decided that sitting a project under a Māori health organisation was going to be the best way of achieving a diagnostic guideline that centred Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And this would then be central as we then also set up the project team, set the steering group and guided stakeholder consultation. It took a year for that all to come together. I think we signed the contract in July 2021. And I just want to remind everyone about what was happening then in 2020 and 2021, 22 with COVID, and how those of us working in health, how difficult it was to get business as usual going, as well as deal with all the lockdowns and the restrictions. But even though there was so much going on, we always held to the importance of relationships and protocols and trying to get them right from the beginning. So the purpose of the project was we were charged with developing an FASD diagnostic guideline that was appropriate for Aotearoa, to assist clinicians in diagnosis, referral and management of FASD, and that those guidelines would be grounded in Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And the important thing about this is that honouring Te Tiriti o Waitangi is more than remedying disadvantage and reducing inequities. It emphasises people's essence, people's mana that is valued, and relationships being the most important for all whānau and communities. And Te Tiriti o Waitangi provides the expectation that Māori flourish and Māori lead those aspirations for Māori health. So what I'm going to do now is just take you through a timeline of the project, because it gives you hopefully a good sense of the whole project, and then we'll talk about pieces throughout the evening. So we've just talked about 2020 and 2021. What happened then is we spent a bit of time setting up the project team, and we prioritised the setting up the team and the steering group, focusing on whanaungatanga and establishing tikanga values and principles. We then started to gather the information we needed to guide our mahi. So you'll see that didn't start till basically a year after we signed the contract, August 2022. The literature review continued across both those years, but the steering group, we spent a lot of time bringing people together and agreeing those terms of reference. So those pieces of research that was really important to guide the project. Most important was the stakeholder consultation, but we also did the literature review and also collaborated with the Australian team. So Tanya's going to talk about the stakeholder consultation. I'll come back a bit later to talk about the literature review, and I'll also talk a bit about the clinical evidence and how we collaborated with Australia. After that, we started drafting the diagnostic guidelines. So this is in about October of last year, and held wānanga with expert clinicians in whānau. And those expert clinicians continue to have opportunities to review and revise alongside whānau in the steering group until February of this year. We then finalised the guidelines and launched them at Papakura Marae at the end of April. So I just want to do a big mihi to the project team. Sarah Goldsbury, Tanya Henderson, Joe Van Wyck, Army Harmer, Dr. Rowan Much, Kara Te Whata Maillard, Dr. Felicity Ware, and Te Aturua Davis. And I just want to say there were many more people who were involved. From the wānanga we held on marae across the country to the steering group, to many people, but I do want to acknowledge Maria Nawati, Janelle Dimas and Salah Hart from Hapai Te Hoora, who were really with us from the beginning and created the basis, a really strong basis that we could develop these guidelines from. So the steering group, Sarah was the tangata whenua lead and I was the tangata tiriti lead, and we wanted our steering group to be represented from both groups. So we worked really hard to have that representation, both tangata whenua and tangata tiriti, from whānau, from professional groups such as psychology, paediatricians, speech language therapists, occupational therapists, and other key experts in health and justice and disability service, as well as cultural experts, including Pasifika Kaimahi. So where did we source the knowledge in terms of laying that foundation for us to build the guideline? Well, as we said, first it was Te Tiriti o Waitangi, then our stakeholder findings from the wānanga we held across marae back in 2022. We looked at Te Ao Māori models because they gave a guide to be able to do really good holistic assessment, as well as look at the research evidence and literature and what pertained for us here in New Zealand. We looked at existing FASD diagnostic guidelines, and then we spent a lot of time collaborating with the Australians with their diagnostic guideline review. As I said, I'll talk a bit more about that later, but Sarah and myself were on their project, and Dr. Natasha Reid very generously gifted all of their data and their evidence to us and attended our clinical wānanga to explain how the information had been brought together. We also looked at other practice guidelines to ensure that these guidelines were aligned with them. So, and of course, you need evaluation. So importantly, we used a critical tiriti analysis, and I want to mihi te Hami Hama, who did this really important piece of work, which assessed in 2022 and 2023 whether we were meeting our responsibilities according to Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And Kara's going to talk a bit more about that later on. Through the Australian project, they used the grade system to evaluate the clinical criteria. And so it was really important to us that we had that same rigour. So both of these were used in the evaluation. So I'm going to stop for now, and you'll see more of me a bit later.